Welcome to Faculty Voices. Today, we have the unusual pleasure of hosting two guests, Raquel Jimenez and David Guerra. Raquel Jimenez is a lecturer on education and co-chair of the Arts and Learning concentration at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. David Guerra is a curator. He's a Harvard Law School alum and a faculty member at universities in Puerto Rico. Together, they hosted Raquel Jimenez's Arts and Cultural Organizing intensive course, which sends Harvard students to Puerto Rico for a learning experience over the January break. Welcome to Faculty Voices.
June, thank you so much for having us. Obviously, so excited to get into the seminar today, but I actually wanted to start the conversation a day before the seminar started on January 5th of this year, because something really important happened on that day. And that is, bear with me for a moment, that Benito Ocasio, or Bad Bunny as he's more commonly known, released his latest album. And in Puerto Rico, this album is as ubiquitous as the island's flag. And if you've ever been to Puerto Rico, you know that is quite the statement. We heard this album everywhere we went. It was quite literally the backdrop and sort of a soundscape for our entire experience. It played in restaurants, it played in our Ubers, and it played on the street. And in every setting, the album's irresistible salsa rhythms and searing lyrics provided a link between the contours of colonialism that have shaped Puerto Rico's past and how those same forces are still with us in the present, shaping this very moment. Of course, Bad Bunny is a peerless iconoclast, but he's also part of a larger art-making tradition in Puerto Rico, where the idea of art for art's sake almost doesn't exist. In Puerto Rico, the stakes are far too high for that. Art isn't something that offers an escape from reality and politics so much as a way of deepening our understanding and engagement of those things. And so I say all of this because this exemplifies one of the most potent roles of art in society, to help us understand the current moments that we're living through, to understand how our individual struggles exist in the context of history and politics, and to help us appreciate the continuities between past and present so that we can take more sort of ownership in forging our future. And so in our increasingly uncertain times, this is also one of the most urgent and pressing tasks of the educator, which brings me to the goals of the course. The seminar was designed particularly for students at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, especially those focused on arts education. The Ed School is where Harvard trains students to be expert teachers, school administrators, and system-level leaders with a global reach. Our motto is Learn to Change the World, and a large population of our students are international students, students who consistently want to be pushed to understand how what they're learning in our classroom spaces apply elsewhere to the world. And so this brings us to Puerto Rico and really thinking about how to craft experiences that allow students to step outside of the classroom and to blur the lines between school and the rest of the world. And so David was a key thought partner in helping to construct that experience.
Before we go on to David, let's take a step back. Why did you choose Puerto Rico to begin with?
Yeah, actually, David can chime in with that too. We thought about this a lot together, but essentially all of the sort of most pressing social issues that we're thinking about and I think are really beginning to be more and more on our radar in the US, things like political instability, climate change, income inequality, oppression on various levels, are things that Puerto Rico, as the world's oldest colony, has been contending with for centuries. So it is, in many ways, the perfect place to go at this particular moment in time.
Perfect because it's imperfect then.
Yeah, perfect because it has quite a bit of experience navigating the same issues that many people are actually, in fact, realizing are issues in this moment. There are things that our privilege, especially here in the US, has perhaps prevented us from experiencing, and that's simply not the case in Puerto Rico.
David, perhaps you could explain briefly or expand briefly on the social and political context Raquel is talking about.
Yeah, I think the island has been facing important political crises and national disasters as well. And for the last 10 years, we have seen the role of art and culture in mobilizing society and claiming for national identity, claiming for decolonization, for racial integration, inclusivity. These are some of the main issues that society in Puerto Rico is facing at the moment. And we have seen how, from artists and cultural managers, cultural agents, we have seen the whole island being multiplied in examples of how to oppose an initiative that the government is trying to push, but society is resisting, or how the artists are facilitating a dialogue, or how the artists are mobilizing resources to even help victims of a hurricane or an earthquake. So these are really vivid and moving examples of how artists and cultural practitioners or creatives in general have been playing a significant role in representing the most beautiful values of the Puerto Rican society.
So, how did you two happen to team up?
Yeah,
Raquel, do you want to talk about it?
yeah, sure. We met completely by chance. So David, as a Harvard Law School alum, has roots in the Boston area, has significant roots in Boston's creative communities. And so we met really through mutual friends, purely at a social gathering. And I remember meeting David and chatting with him about his interests, but then him saying, and me just thinking, oh, I want to collaborate with David. I have to find ways to work with this guy. And he said, I'm moving to Puerto Rico tomorrow. And so I thought, in that case, we may have to wait to collaborate. But then, let's see, maybe a year or two later, I joined the faculty of the Ed School. And of course, we are quite lucky to have the connection with the Rockefeller Center. So I thought, hey, all the ingredients are now coming together to explore what a collaboration with David could look like. And he, quite honestly, is the perfect person in the perfect place. That's how we were able to bring it together.
Thank you, Raquel. That's very kind of you. I mentioned that I was very interested in exploring the Caribbean. I'm from Cuba originally, from Havana. However, Havana is not a place that normally feels connected to the rest of the Caribbean. Maybe at the beginning, always looking at Spain, then afterwards looking at the US. But it was during the first years of the revolution that I think the government in Cuba tried to connect the island with the rest of the Caribbean. However, because of the difficulties and issues that the Cuban government is facing in Cuba and the lack of resources to get together in the Caribbean, I was really excited to go back after living in Boston for almost 15 years to understand what was happening in the Caribbean. And I chose Puerto Rico because I thought that it was the most relevant place in the Caribbean where I could see what's happening in the entire region, like how these issues are being confronted and how the artists are responding to these issues. And I fell in love with the island. I've never felt more Caribbean in my life. This is the moment where I have now spent almost 2 years in dialogue with artists, with professors, with other activists in the culture and social justice movement here in Puerto Rico. So it has been a really productive experience of trying to understand what it means to be Caribbean today. What are the challenges for Caribbean societies, and how from Puerto Rico we can implement initiatives that could talk about sustainability for a region, for diversity, inclusion in a region, for decolonization in a region. So all these topics were very interesting to me. And this is why I have chosen to have one step in Puerto Rico, one step in Boston, and building bridges between the two places at the moment.
So, Raquel, listening to what David has been talking about, what's the relevance of this experience to Harvard and to the Graduate School of Education in particular?
Yeah, many ways to answer that question. But as I was saying a moment ago, all of the sort of pressing issues that we're dealing with in more significant ways, I think particularly in the realm of political instability. One thing that David pointed out is that in the absence of political self-determination, which Puerto Rico certainly lacks, culture becomes a major lever for social change. And I think there are some serious questions about the stability of democracies across the world. More questions are certainly landing in the US about the strength of our own democracy and our institutions. And so all of this is creating so much anxiety about an increasingly uncertain future. None of these complex social issues are irrelevant to art. Contemporary artists are making art that is deeply reflective of these issues, again, particularly in Puerto Rico. And all of this holds so much enormous potential for many parts of society, but especially those working within the field of education. Young people are coming of age at a time when the future looks and feels increasingly unknowable. And this is actually fueling a worldwide crisis in youth mental health. And so if young people are having all of this land on their shoulders, we really need educators that can help young people navigate this uncertainty productively. And to do this, educators can actually just look to artists, the cultural workers who are representing forgotten histories, illuminating complex realities, orienting the public towards new visions of possibility. And all of these acts of creativity are really what's needed to reclaim a sense of agency and power in, again, an increasingly uncertain world. And so with all of that context in mind, David really curated a set of site visits where the folks that we engaged with, the master practitioners and leading thinkers, were people that we connected with, that the students got to learn from. And so all of them were entered the space with their own sort of inquiries and guiding questions, and are now working to translate what they saw into program design, into curriculum, into pedagogy.
Interesting. Could you talk a little bit specifically about where the students went and what they saw?
Sure, we can mention three of the cultural projects that we selected for the program. The first one is called Lagoico. This is a community cultural center, basically a group of artists and community agents and social workers coming together to claim space in a neighborhood where there has been a lot of gentrification and a lot of displacement because of the crisis, economic, political crisis in Puerto Rico in the past. Many schools were left abandoned in the country, and this community project took over one of these spaces and basically like a cooperative. It's a very beautiful example of seeing a group of creatives and cultural agents coming together to distribute resources, to raise funds, to build a program, to connect with the community in ways that we have, at least I never saw before entering that place. And it is really touching to see how they work together. We visited an artist's workshop.
What I want to say about that in particular, that was such this cooperative, heavily DIY model was very inspiring for our students to see because, again, particularly within this context, there's a whole host of assumptions about what people need to get their ideas off the ground. And a lot of that starts with raising funding and writing grants and navigating all of these different levers of bureaucracy and gatekeeping. And in Puerto Rico, that is because there isn't the infrastructure. People generally do not bother with that. If they have an idea, they find collaborators, they make it happen. And of course, that is incredibly difficult to do, but the fact of the matter is that it is possible. And so for our students to see that model of possibility and for them to realize, oh, all of the assumptions that I have about the things that I need that I actually don't have, it was really, I think it meant a lot to have those assumptions be challenged. And ever since, our students have been organizing their own pop-ups and taking up space, for better or worse, with their own ideas, with their own practices. And so, yeah, stretching their imagination, encountering these other models of possibility, simply, that's learning that cannot happen from reading a textbook.
That's certainly true. David, you were saying that this was one of the three visits you wanted to talk about?
Yes, at this community center, we met Yolanda Velasquez, and she runs a workshop that highlights the work of women in the arts. And these are women from different generations coming together to address the most important issues that they face here in Puerto Rico. And the students had the chance of talking to Yolanda and seeing how the work has been done from that tiny space, but also from her own home that she has turned into a gallery space where she shares what she does with all these women in the arts. Then the students visited another project. In this case, was outside the city of San Juan. It's called Bayamón. This is a municipality right next to San Juan. And their artists have been finding relief in a way, because in every single place you go to explore what's the status of the arts, always having access to space is one of the most pressing issues for the artist. Where to live, where to create. And this is a really interesting project where the city of Bayamón has been inviting 6 artists simultaneously to occupy 6 beautiful workshops and homes where they can create for 2 years. And in this case, we selected 2 of the artists that are residents right now at this project. So we had the chance of talking to them about what it means to have that kind of support from the city. And these 2 artists have very different practices. One of them is a multimedia artist focusing on cultural heritage. We thought that was a really important artist that they could meet. And another artist is a painter who he had the chance of doing an MFA in the US, but then came back to Puerto Rico and started to create a dialogue for what it means to be in the diaspora, what it means to be back, and what are the bridges that are being built between Puerto Rico and its diasporas, and what it means to be relocated, how to build a future from here. So these are some of the conversations that the students were able to have while visiting them in Bayamón. And then we closed the seminar by organizing a session that it became a very spiritual, beautiful, moving session with the founders and some of the members of a collective that is celebrating now 31 years of active participation in the arts, not only in Puerto Rico, but also internationally. They're called Agua, Sol y Sereno. They're really famous. That translates water, sun, and dew. And this is a multidisciplinary collective that they have been very active in engaging the community to co-create in theater, dance, art making. So we hosted this beautiful session at their headquarters, and we got to know how the whole collective came together, the values that inspired the collective, and how they teach community members to join them or other cultural agents to join the collective, and what is the role of art as in activism, in social activism, what it means to be an art activist in Puerto Rico. So we were very proud and grateful for the opportunity that we had of connecting the Harvard students with such an important collective in the archipelago of Puerto Rico.
And
Raquel, if you want to add more about that.
Yeah, just briefly, such an important through line for all of the sites was this idea of the collective, right? And that is particularly important because there are these myths of the individual artist, the individual genius, the person that toils in their garage in solitude, perfecting their craft. And I think in Puerto Rico, again, we saw a very powerful counterexample, right? In many ways, creativity is always collective. It's just whether or not all of the parts of the process are made visible as such. Nobody ever really truly creates in solitude. There's always a dialogue. There are always collaborators in some sense or another. And in Puerto Rico, all of that is so key to the process of creativity, to the work that we saw. And so to see that part of the work, again, that is not often visible, I think really underlined for the students that were with us that they don't have to do things alone, right? That they need to be looking always for collaborators, for allies, for peers that share their interests, and thinking about this in the context of mutual aid and how to support one another, again, in the context in which institutions perhaps are not as strong as they are in other places, right? So you rely on who you have, what you have, and you wind up working in different ways. And again, in the context of here, where there's some serious questions about the strength of our institutions, seeing other ways of working, seeing other ways of being is just so important.
Oh, that's really interesting. You mentioned before, Raquel, about these pop. Could you
Mhm.
talk a little bit more about that and any other ways that you know of that this trip has influenced the students?
Yeah, so the students that were eligible to take the class had to complete a class that I taught in the fall called Practices in Community Art. And so that class, it was theoretical in the sense that we spent a long time thinking about sort of the underlying theories that support community-based art, which is a really distinct realm of creative practice that involves collaborations between artists and activists and members of the public to advance some shared goal, often using various arts and media strategies to affect change. And so the students, they were deeply engaged in the theoretical learning, and there was a practical component. But again, sort of their assignments were to organize their own workshops. And what I heard a lot as an instructor was, but we don't have this. We don't have the budget. We don't have the space. Of course, all of the constraints that artists are always coming up against, right? Those are always challenges. And that became a way of limiting their own sort of agency, a kind of thinking that limited their own creative power, their own agency. And to go to Puerto Rico and to see the collective that David just mentioned, basically having their workshop on the street, preparing for a massive festival, and instead of paying their collaborators to help them make their masks, we're offering them food, right? And so there's this exchange of labor, of passion, that happens like outside of the context of like strictly capitalist ways and economic ways of exchange, right? There's these other ways of exchanging and building and creating work together that I think we've been socialized to perhaps forget are other ways of doing things. So after Puerto Rico, I haven't been hearing, oh, we can't. It's more about, okay, who's with us? What do we already have? And how can we make this happen? Actually, just Friday at the Ed School, students organized through, I think in partnership with the Center for Wellbeing at Harvard, a festival called Ode to Joy, Sounds of the Diaspora. Very mixed media, music, performance, workshops, all kinds of things happening within the span of a Friday afternoon. And they did it in partnership with other student affinity groups. So they had an immigrant student organizing group with us. They had a first gen group with us. They were reaching out to Harvard can be so siloed, but my students are constantly now looking for ways to break those silos, to bring people in and to bring people together. And it was a phenomenal success. They pulled on a Friday afternoon about 100 people together to come be in community and to simply to be together and to create. So there's much more finding cracks of possibility in places that things can seem rather rigid and impossible. And that's exactly the kind of disposition that we encountered in Puerto Rico and the disposition that we need to be cultivating, I think, all of the time now.
Wow, that is fantastic to hear about that. David, we were chatting a bit earlier about your curatorial approach. Could you talk a bit about that?
I love sharing people's stories, particularly when it comes to unconventional ways of being in the arts. So I did that while I was in Boston, and I tried to focus on that when teaching curatorial seminars here in Puerto Rico. So now that I'm teaching in Puerto Rico, I've been trying to adopt an approach that is centered in initiatives like the ones that I just mentioned before, cooperativism, solidarity. How can we gain in representation? How can we align our identity and our values through our artistic practices? It has been really, for me, a great way of decolonizing even the way I was teaching curatorial studies in the US. So being now in the Caribbean, trying to interview the people who have been doing it for a while and their achievements and amplifying their voices, because otherwise, and I think this is one of the main priorities for all the projects in Puerto Rico, documenting all this, because it's about our memory. The future of the country relies on, of any nation, relies on its memory, and it's important to be documenting what they're doing and how this is also passed from one generation to another one. So I've been trying as a curator and as a curatorial professor, encouraging the students to understand where they come from, what they have done in the past, how other people have done it here in Puerto Rico, and how they have represented their voices, so that they use that as a reference to build the future as well. And my role has always been a facilitator. And when I was in Boston, now that I'm here, and I'm very grateful that I have the opportunity to be unlocking all these opportunities to my students, to the people who come to visit, to the artists that they want to enter in dialogue with. I'm very pleased with the results, and I'm committing to even launching new curatorial platforms from Puerto Rico to unite the Caribbean. So I'm very excited, not only to unite the Caribbean, but also, as I mentioned before, to build bridges with the Caribbean. This is a region that has experienced it all in the past. Everything that is being taught in the US, so in some way or another one, has a connection with the Caribbean. So we're very conscious of that. And I think it's important to continue to mobilize students and practitioners and creators from all over the world about the topics that we face here, because it's a future that is being shared, not just our future.
Raquel, do you have anything to add to that?
Just a couple of thoughts. Another curator friend that I have mentioned at one point that to curate something, the root word of curate relates to acts of care. So it's things that you care about. And David, the other thing that you're doing that's so important is that you're finding things that you love. You even said the word love very early in this conversation. And you are platforming those things. You're finding ways to connect these practices that for you are about connecting to memory and linking that to possible futures and sustaining cultures. But you're also platforming those works and sharing them with a larger audience. And I think that is also really essential cultural work, connecting these artists. That it's so interesting to me that when we went to Casitas de Bayamón, we met with artists that were just so humble, so modest about their practice. And yet one of them was also shipping their work to the Smithsonian. So it's these artists that are just extremely talented, that are quite under the radar in some ways in terms of broader public understanding and public profiles. But I think that you're changing that, David. You're making sure that everyone knows about the art and culture in Puerto Rico. And so I just wanted to say that was essential. The other thing about curation is that that was a really underlying philosophy of the course itself, this idea of, in the context of education, pedagogical curation, which is the idea that teachers can help students learn most effectively by designing learning experiences and then also selecting materials that are most relevant to student interests. And for all of that to work effectively, two things have to happen. Students have to take more ownership over the course of their own learning, in the sense that they have to come ready to engage with their own interests, to reflect on what those interests are, to make a plan for how to pursue those interests. And then also, as educators, we have to really know about what the affordances of a given environment are, so that we can help students establish through lines and connect the dots. And so this is all just in terms of the academic aspects of the course. This is all a long way of saying that students came to Puerto Rico with their own questions, their own motivations for being there, knowing that, of course, we were looking at a very specific context. And so students really took different things from that experience, again, based on their interests. But the sort of through line for all of us was that they all gained sort of these tools for disciplined, self-directed learning, and also learning how to channel their own observations into a compelling piece of public-facing writing for a broader audience. So they're all now working on op-eds to share with a publication called Rethinking Schools, which is a leading practitioner-facing publication in the field of education. So they have channeled this experience really into some really powerful thinking for themselves and a voice to guide the field, which is exciting.
Are you planning to take students back to Puerto Rico?
Yes, we are. I think it is a little bit to be determined when and how that will happen. But I think that we have a really successful proof of concept on our hands for many reasons. And the educational situation in Puerto Rico, it's worth noting that it is essentially, Puerto Rico is considered, because of the relationship with the United States, it's administered by the Department of Education. It would be the 7th largest school district if people remembered that Puerto Rico was part of the US. And yet there are some major crises that the island is dealing with, where the costs of housing are really rising. About 50% of schools in Puerto Rico have shut over the past decade. And so many families are leaving the island, and the families and children that are remaining, again, are really thinking about an uncertain future. And our students understood that piece of the puzzle while they were there. And some of them are planning to pursue teaching careers in Puerto Rico. So yes, to David's point, it's about building these bridges between the US and Puerto Rico, between Harvard and Puerto Rico in particular, and keeping this dialogue going.
So I'd like to know from each of you a closing statement of why this is important and what are your future goals for building bridges between Harvard and Puerto Rico.
I can start. For me, this is important primarily for some very deep historical reasons. Prior to this trip, I was doing so much reading, trying to understand, like, how is it that all of these things could be happening politically in Puerto Rico? I understood that it was a colony, but I was like, how is this the situation? And it turns out that Puerto Rico is a colony due to a series of Supreme Court cases called the Insular cases that happened in the early 1900s. But before those cases were decided, the logics, the legal frameworks by which those cases came about was actually incubated at the law school. So this is all to say that Harvard is directly implicated in the colonization of Puerto Rico. And so if that is the case, we have a role to play in seriously thinking about how we address the situation in Puerto Rico. And frankly, we have some wonderful alums. The Harvard Puerto Rico Club is phenomenally strong and engaged, and they want to see Harvard be part of the conversation, as do I, frankly. Education in particular, historically, across contexts, has been a tool for colonization. And so for my students to also confront that history and to think about their roles as educators, how do we acknowledge histories that are not ones that are typically taught in schools, right? What is the role of teaching about someone's history so that they understand who they are, so that, again, they're putting their struggles in these larger political contexts. Education has a very powerful role to play in Puerto Rico at the level of individual students, but also politically. And so, yes, I am very committed to seeing Harvard continue to engage with Puerto Rico. And the fact of the matter is that we have partners on the ground that want to see that relationship grow as well.
David?
It's very inspiring to see a university paying attention to what's happening here and how students, the best of their classes from all over the world, they go to Harvard, and then from there, they have the opportunity to learn from some of the best faculty from all over the world as well. But having the opportunity to see how people are getting organized, how people are using different models to learn, to secure resources, to aim for a more sustainable future, that's a case study. This is something that you cannot just cover in the pages of a manual beautifully written by an academic. Coming to Puerto Rico is getting immersed in a very challenging experience that goes beyond any theoretical framework. So seeing the university paying attention to alternative models of everything that they touched when they came here is actually, I think, if I had been at Harvard at that time, I would have really appreciated that opportunity. And I think the students really seized that opportunity, and they went back to school transformed and more united as a class as well. That was a beautiful expression to see them hugging each other and sharing amazing stories at the very last day of the seminar. It was a very moving experience for me as a professor as well to witness it.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to Faculty Voices with Raquel Jimenez and David Guerra. Thank you very much, Raquel and David.
Thank you, June, for having us.
Thank you, June.